Hi everyone, this is Ray singing Tallit. Picking up on reading chapter 1 from book 2 of Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. The first book pretty much is laid out the history of the kind of East meets West conflict that's going on in the Middle East at the time that Yeshua is coming onto the scene. Not so much that we've even seen him actually mentioned in the book yet. He hasn't actually made it into being mentioned, but he is. We've got the groundwork set to understand what he's going to face when he comes into comes onto the scene in the Israelite world. Hey, Arnie, when he comes onto the scene in the Israelite world. I'm going to pick it up here. Chapter 1 is titled, In Jerusalem When Herod Reigned. Now remember that Herod, King Herod the Great, referred to himself as King of the Jews. He was an appointee of Augustus Caesar. He was not a member of the Hasmonean dynasty, but he married into the Hasmonean dynasty. He was a friend of Caesar, and that allowed him the privilege of actually handling all the administration of the government there. And when he passed, his sons were each given a portion of the kingdom to make sure that nobody as wealthy and powerful as the single Herod had been could come up. By the way, he died a pretty terrible death of some kind of lower bodily infection that involved worms literally living inside of his lower body. Just a little tidbit to tantalize. If you watch if you have an Amazon Prime account, there's a show on there called The Naked Archaeologist, where they go into detail about understanding how exactly Herod the Great died. Chapter 1, In Jerusalem When Herod Reigned. If the dust of 10 centuries could have been wiped from the eyelids of those sleepers, and one of them who thronged Jerusalem in the high day of its glory, during the reign of King Solomon, had returned to its streets, he would scarcely have recognized the once familiar city. Then, as now, a Jewish king reigned, who bore undivided rule over the whole land. Then, as now, the city was filled with riches, adorned with palaces and architectural monuments. Then, as now, Jerusalem was crowded with strangers from all the lands. Solomon and Herod were each the last Jewish king over the land of promise. Solomon and Herod each built the great temple, but with the son of David began, and with the Idumean it ended. The kingdom, or rather, having fulfilled its mission, it gave place to the spiritual world kingdom of David's greater son. The scepter departed from Judah to where the nations were to gather under its sway, and the temple which Solomon built was the first. In the Shekinah it had dwelt visibly, or the Shekinah, that's to say the visible cloud-like presence of God, had dwelled in the temple of Solomon. The temple which Herod reared was the last. The ruins of its burning, which the torches of the Romans had kindled, were never to be restored. Herod was not the antitype. He was the Barabbas of David's royal son. Of course, here he's trying to contrast King Solomon's temple with the temple that Herod had built. Now remember, this book is written in the 1880s, so this man had no clue and no inkling to have ever known that there would ever be a reborn nation called Israel in the Middle East. Last that he would have known at this time was that just like if you've ever read, there's Mark Twain wrote a little bit about visiting Palestine. He talked about how the whole place was a barren wasteland, that the only thing that would grow there was olives and wild thickets, because basically they're such a hardy plant that you really just can't kill them. And he said even they had trouble growing in the unfertile, barren land of Palestine. And that was the world that Alfred Edersheim knew. So don't, read too deeply into his proselytizing for Christianity that you're going to hear him do some of. Remember, this is a man who's an Anglican priest, but he was born a Jew, and he was definitely the world scholar on Jewry at the time, at least among people who weren't officially Jewish. In other respects, also the difference was almost equally great. The 4 companion-like hills on which the city was built, the deep clefts by which it was surrounded, the mountain of olives rising in the east, were the same as 1,000 years ago. There was of old were the pools of Siloam and the royal gardens. Nay, the very wall that had then surrounded the city, and yet all was so alerted as to be scarcely recognizable. Altered as to be scarcely recognizable. The ancient Jebusite fort, the city of David, Mount Zion, was now the priest's quarters, Ophel, and the old royal palace and stables had been thrown into the temple area, now completely leveled, where they formed the magnificent treble colonnade known as the royal porch. Passing through it and out the western gate of the temple, we stand on the immense bridge which spans the, quote, Valley of the Cheesemongers, or the Tyropaion, and connects the eastern with the western hills of the city. It is perhaps here that we can best mark the outstanding features and note the changes. On the right, as we look northward, are on the eastern hill, Ophel, and the priest's quarter, and the temple. Oh, how wondrously beautiful and enlarged, and rising terrace upon terrace, surrounded by massive walls, a palace, a fortress, a sanctuary of shining marble and glittering gold. It, beyond its frowns and old fortresses of Barras, rebuilt by Herod, and named after his patron Antonia. This is the hill of Zion. Right below us is the cleft of the Tyropaion, and here creeps up northward the lower city of Acra, in the form of a crescent, widening into an almost square suburb across the Tyropaion. Westward rises the upper city. If the lower city and the suburb from the business quarter, with its markets, bazaars, and streets and trade guilds, the upper city is that of the palaces. Here at the other end of the great bridge which connects the temple with the upper city is the palace of the Maccabees. Beyond it, the Xystos, or vast colonnade enclosure, where popular assemblies are held. When the palace of Ananias, the high priest, and nearest to the temple, the council chamber and public archives. Behind it, westward, rise terrace upon terrace, the stately mansions of the upper city, till quite in the northwest corner of the old city, we reach the palace where Herod had built for himself almost a fortress, flanked by 3 high towers and enclosing spacious gardens. Beyond it again, and outside the city walls, both the first and the second stretches, all north of the city, the new suburb of Bethesda. Here on every side are gardens and villas. Here passes the great northern road. Out there must have been laid hold on Simon the Cyrene, and here must have led the way to the place of the crucifixion. So he's giving you a description of the grandiose nature that Jerusalem had at the time that Herod was king over it. You got to remember, this place was like Disneyland. When you come in, you don't come in bringing your nasty old sacrifice from the country. The country people, you need to bring your money, and the priesthood has got plenty of flocks ready for you to contribute to have an offering bought. This is the idea of bringing money to the money changers, so you can buy a perfect lamb that's already been pre-approved. It's already ready to go. When you're doing Passover sacrifices and you got 1 million plus people coming in, you don't have time for everybody to bring in their own little lamb and house him up in their little house, and then make sure everything's done just right. And then somehow you got to streamline things. They talk about how with gallons and thousands of gallons of blood were being spilled on the altar, and how they had a water system set up to just wash it all away. And they just push a button and the whole thing would be washed clean by a flowing river of water. The other point I want to make is that Herod had to expand the foundations of the Temple Mount. Basically, they built a retaining wall and filled the whole thing in with stones. Now, the stones there were some of the biggest that had ever been found in archaeology. I mean, that's like stones that weigh 600,000 tons that are just laying, and nobody even understands how they got there. Which, I mean, I don't know. There may be stones at Baalbek that are that big too, but there's it's just odd how they even got them there to build with. But I guess that's some of those ancient secrets that we just don't know nothing about now. There's some gigantic stones that were piled up to help make this foundation. The interesting thing is, though, without that foundation that Herod had built, there could be no foundation large enough ready for the temple of Ezekiel, as he described it, to be built. So Herod may have laid the foundation for that prophecy to come true one day. Changes that marked the checkered course of Israel's history had come even over the city walls. The first and the oldest that of David and Solomon, ran round the west side of the upper city, then crossed south of the pool of Siloam, and ran out east round Ophel, till it reached the eastern enclosure of the temple, whence it passed in a straight line to the point from which it had started, forming the northern boundary of the ancient city. But although this wall still existed, there was now a marked addition to it. When the Maccabee Jonathan finally cleared Jerusalem of the Syrian garrison that lay in Fort Acra, he built a wall right through the middle of the city, so as to shut out the foe. This wall probably ran from the western angle of the temple southward to near the pool of Siloam, following the winding course of the Tyropaphion. But on the other side of it were the declivity of the upper city merged into the valley. Another monument of the Syrian wars and the Maccabees and of Herod was the fortress Antonia, part of it probably been formerly occupied by what was known as Fort Acra, or such unhappy prominence in the wars that preceded and marked the city of the Maccabean period. The Fortress Antonius, or Fortress Antonia, is where the Roman guard would watch the courtyard of the temple from. The Romans would keep an eye out to make sure that no rebel rousers started up. In fact, that's why when Paul was about to be killed, the Roman soldiers rushed out and grabbed a hold of the people to keep them from going out there and starting having a blood spilling all over the place in the temple. Interestingly, when Yeshua went out into the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers, the Roman guard should have immediately been like, nope, and went right down there and started locking him in chains and getting him out of there. But for some reason, they did not respond when he went out there and started overturning those tables and chasing people around with a cord of whips, which probably hyssop wound together, in the sense of him cleaning his father's house, in preparation for unleavened bread. But it's strange that for some reason those Roman soldiers did not move and did not pursue him, even though they would go out there for anybody else that was causing a ruckus. It had passed from the Ptolemies to the Syrians, and always formed the central spot around which the fight of the city turned. Judah Maccabee had not been able to take it. Jonathan had laid siege to it and built the wall, to which reference has been made, so as to isolate its garrison. It was the last taken by Simon, the brother and successor of Jonathan, and leveled with the ground in 141 B.C. Fort Barras, which was constructed by his successor Hyrcanus the first, and he's ruled from 135 to 106 B.C., covered a much wider space. It lay on the northwestern angle of the temple, slightly jutting it beyond it in the east, but not covering the whole northern area of the temple. The rock on which it stood was higher than the temple, although lower than the hill up which the new suburb of Bezetha crept, which accordingly was cut off by a deep ditch for the safety of the fortress. Herod greatly enlarged and strengthened it. Within encircling walls, the fort rose to the height of 60 feet, and was flanked by 4 towers, on which 3 had the height of 70, and the 4th, which jutted into the temple area, this is the one from which they'd watch the temple, 105 feet. So the tallest of the towers was the one that was overlooking the temple, so as to command the sacred enclosure. The subterranean passage led into the temple itself, and that's described in the Antiquities, Josephus's Antiquities, which was also connected with it by a colonnade and stairs. Herod had adorned as well as strengthened and enlarged this fort, now Antonia, and made it into a palace, an armored camp, and almost a city in itself, according to Josephus in the Wars of the Jews. So naturally, Herod is considered the great builder because, he didn't just rebuild the temple. He built a monument to Augustus. He built cities in the north. He even did something that really made the local Jews mad, where he actually put a big golden Roman eagle over the entrance to the temple area. That did not fly, no pun intended, with the folks there. That went over like a golden eagle. No, that's a bad joke. No joke is bad. Hitherto we have only spoken of the first, or old wall, which is fortified by 60 towers. The second wall, which had only 14 towers, began at some point in the northern wall at the gate of Ganath, whence it ran north, then east, so as to enclose Acra and the suburb. It terminated at Fort Antonio. Beyond and all around this second wall stretched, and as already noticed, the new, as yet unenclosed suburb of Bethesda, rising towards the northeast. But these changes were as nothing compared with those within the city itself. First and foremost was the great transformation of the temple itself, which from a small building, little larger than an ordinary church in the time of Solomon, had become the great and glorious house which which excited the admiration of the foreigner and kindled the enthusiasm of every son of Israel. Remember, even Augustus Caesar made sure that there was money put into this temple so that he could have regular sacrifices made on behalf of his son. And that's not uncommon for Roman dignitaries and officials to have supplied money to make sure that sacrifices were being made on account of their family members, because part of the way that the Romans would actually conquer a place is that they would go to it and they would pray to the local gods of the area and say, listen, if you will give us this land, we will honor you with more sacrifices and more offerings than you have ever received from the people that are on here. We will show you the Rome honor like only Rome can give it. And that was the justification that they would make for why it was acceptable for them to come in, because they would literally say, hey, we discussed it with your gods, and your gods gave it to us. At the time of Christ, it had been already 46 years in building, and the workmen were still, and for a long time, engaged on it. But what a heterogeneous crowd thronged its porches and courts. Hellenists, scattered wanderers from distant parts of the earth, east, west, north, and south, Galileans, quick of temper, and uncouth of Jewish speech. The reason I say that is because you remember Peter was a Galilean, and they knew it when he spoke, because he couldn't pronounce certain words properly. His speech gave him away as being a Galilean when he spoke Hebrew or Aramaic. Judeans and Jerusalemites, white-robed priests and Levites, temple officials, broad-phylacteried, wide-fringed Pharisees, and courtly, ironical Sadducees, and in the outer court, curious Gentiles. Some had come to worship, others to pay vows or bring offerings or to seek purification, some to meet friends and discourse on religious subjects in those colonnaded porches which ran around the sanctuary, or else to have their questions answered or their causes heard and decided by the smaller Sanhedrin of 23 that sat in the entering of the gate, or by the great Sanhedrin. Now, he's pointing this out because you remember when Yeshua is at the temple during Hanukkah, or during the Feast of Dedication, he is at Solomon's porch. He's in the place where you would have, if you would have been an outsider, you could have actually gone and actually been taught by a rabbi who was there, because the porch of Solomon is just outside the Gentiles' court. You cross through the porch of Solomon to enter into the Gentiles' court. That's the place where the Gentiles are actually allowed to be. So he was walking out in a place where the Gentiles were allowed to be. He wasn't just in the court of Israel, which would have been forbidden for Gentiles, or probably for a woman too, to enter into. Excuse me. All right. Or else their questions answered, or their causes decided by the small Sanhedrin or the great Sanhedrin. The latter no longer occupied the hall of hewn stones, that is gazith, because of course gazit is hewn stone in Hebrew, but met in some chamber attached to those shops or booths on the Temple Mount, which belonged to the high priestly family of Ananias, and where such profitable trade was driven by those who, in their cupidity and covetousness, were worthy successors of the sons of Eli. In the court of the Gentiles, all right, let's remember who the sons of Eli are. If you remember, the high priest Eli, he had two sons who were known for taking bribes, and when people would bring up their offerings, instead of boiling it and then cooking it, which was the customary practice to make sure there was no fat on it, they would just take the meat that they wanted, throw it on the grill, and cook it how they wanted and eat it. And people were noticing that this was allowing them to get a lot of fat on their meat, which, like I said, is technically not the custom. I mean, it doesn't actually say in the Torah, boil the meat so that you don't get fat, but it does say don't eat fat. And the customary practice was to boil meat to get the fat to come out of it, then to barbecue it on the grill, or I'm sorry, on the altar, which was a big grill. In the court of the Gentiles, or in its porches, sat the official money changers, who, for a fixed discount, changed all foreign coins into those of the sanctuary. Here also was the great market for sacrificial animals, and all that was requisite for offerings. How the simple, earnest country people, who came to pay vows or to bring offerings for purification, must have wondered, and felt oppressed in that atmosphere of strangely blended religious rigorism and utter worldliness. How they must have been taxed, imposed upon them, and treated with the utmost curtness, nay, rudeness, by those who laughed at their boorishness and despised them as cursed, ignorant country people, little better than heathens, or, for that matter, than of brute beasts. So what he's saying there is the Pharisees had made it a practice to consider, of course they wouldn't have anything to do with Gentiles, unless of course there was money involved. And they didn't want to have anything to do with people who lived in the country, farmers, basically the dirt farmers who lived in the country, because they considered them uneducated. They, though yes, had the bloodline, they lacked the religious teaching that would have made them proper, clean Jews. So they considered them to be unclean people, even though technically, yes, they were Jews. Here also there lay about a crowd of noisy beggars, unsightly from disease and clamorous for help. And close by passed the luxurious scion of the high priestly families, the proud, intensely self-conscious teachers of the law, respectfully followed by disciples, and the quick-witted, subtle scribe. These were men who on Sabbaths and feast days would come out of the temple terrace to teach people, or condescend to answer their questions, who in the synagogues would hold their puzzled hearers spellbound by their traditional lore and subtle argumentation, or tickle the fancy of an entranced multitude, that for their clever sayings, but who would, if occasionally on occasion quire, quell an opponent by well-poised questions, or crush him beneath the sheer weight of authority. Yet others were there who, despite the utterly lowering influence which the frivolities of the prevalent religion and the elaborate triflings of its endless observances must have exercised on the moral and religious feelings of all, perhaps because of them turned aside and looked back with a loving gaze to the spiritual promises of the past, and forward with longing expectancy to the near, quote, consolation of Israel, unquote, waiting for it in prayerful fellowship, and with bright, heaven-granted gleams of its dawning light amidst the encircling gloom. That was one sentence, by the way. That is possibly the longest sentence I've ever read in my entire life. Let me see if I can sum it up. He does not like how okay, you'd go into a synagogue, right? You're trying to learn. They'll read a little bit of the Torah, and then for the next many hours, you will hear rabbis, professional teachers, professional rabbis, argue about what it actually means, what you read, and they'll give you other rabbis' interpretations. They'll give you the oral law, or the Mishnah. The Mishnah wasn't written at this time, but the oral law, which is the traditions that are passed between rabbi to students, and they will tell you their different Haggadah, or their different proper interpretation of what this is supposed to mean. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the halakha, which is the appropriate way to walk it out. They taught halakha, which is the things you must do to walk as a Jew, and they would tell you Haggadah, which is their personal interpretations of what these things mean and how you should behave, but they didn't necessarily treat it like it was a legal ordinance. For instance, Yeshua's part of his Haggadah is, he would say, if you have looked on a woman in lust, you have already committed adultery in your heart. And you'd be like, oh no. Does that mean I need to be killed when I look on a woman in lust? No. If you commit adultery, you're supposed to be killed. But if you look on a woman in lust, that doesn't mean that someone should run up to you and say, I'm reading your brain and you just looked at that woman with lust, I'm going to kill you. That would be inappropriate, obviously. So it's not halakha to not look on a woman in lust and expect, a death penalty. To look on a woman in lust and expect a death penalty, that's not part of halakha. But to act in an adulterous manner would be a way in which you could expect penalty. Okay? Does that make sense? I hope so. So what he's saying is, there was such a heavy burden of knowing the traditions, the practices, and everything else. You would have to spend years and years and years and years of your life in the shul, or the yeshiva. Shul, by the way, that's the word that school comes from. When you go to school, you're going to shul to learn as a child, right? So the Jews would go to shul, and they would learn how to be Jewish. Basically, they'd learn to speak the language, they'd learn the halakha, and then they'd start getting into the more advanced learning of all the different interpretations of what these different famous rabbis would say. And then whoever the current great master rabbi was. At the time, it was Hillel. Hillel was the Nazi. He was the prince of the Sanhedrin, and right under him was Shammai, who was the Av Beit Din, that meant that he was the father of the Beit Din. He was the vice president, essentially, and his word was second to that of Hillel. And most of the time you see Yeshua is repeating the words of Hillel when it comes to the oral Torah, but he does side with Shammai when the issue of divorcement without a written divorcement comes up. Descending from the temple into the city, there was more than enlargement due to the increased population. Altogether, Jerusalem covered, at its greatest, about 3,000 acres. As of old, there were still the same narrow streets in the business quarters. And this is, by the way, when he says take the narrow path, the narrow gate. That's the gate that runs into the houses where you would end up on top of people's houses, which is where you would actually travel lots of times. If you wanted to avoid the hustle and bustle of the bazaar in the city and having to go and buy and sell things, you would have to take the narrow gate, which would lead you up onto people's houses where you would travel across the tops of houses, which is usually where people were hanging out and talking to each other and enjoying each other's company, not doing business. So here we go. Descending from the temple, all right. As of old, there were still the same narrow streets in the business quarter, but in close contiguity to the bazaars and shops rose stately mansions of wealthy merchants and the palaces of princes. And what a change in the aspect of these streets, and the character of those shops, and above all in the appearance of the restless eastern crowd that surged to and fro. Outside their shops in the streets, or at least in the sight of the passers, and within the reach of their talk, was the shoemaker hammering sandals together, the tailor plying with the needle, the carpenter at work with iron and brass. Those who were less busy or more enterprising passed along, wearing some emblem of their trade, the dyer, the variously colored threads. On the carpenter, the ruler, or the ruler, the writer would carry a reed behind his ear. The tailor would, with a needle prominently stuck in his dress. In the side streets, the less attractive occupations of such as the butcher, or the wool comber, or the flax spinner were carried on. Speaking of the wool comber, sorry. Cashmere is made of wool, and the process of making cashmere is done by hands, at least in the old days it was. And let me tell you, that is one strange thing to witness. A man, shirtless, well-muscled, with a ball of wool smashed against him, smashing it into a wall, throwing it against a wall, over and over again, and smashing it and throwing it, and smashing it and throwing it, and like doing 10,000 crunches a day on a wool ball to create cashmere. Just extremely softened wool, right? But it takes a lot of human effort to do something like that back before they understood the chemistry and had machines to do all that kind of stuff. In these large, shady halls, artistic trades were pursued. The elegant workmanship of the goldsmith and the jeweler in the various articles de luxe, that is, luxurious things, that adorn the houses of the rich, the work of the designer, the molder, or the artificer of iron and brass. In these streets and lanes everything might be purchased, the production of Palestine or imported from lands foreign, nay, the rarest articles from the remotest parts of the world, exquisitely shaped, curiously designed and jeweled cups, rings, and other workmanship of precious metals, glass, silks, fine linen, woolen stuffs, purple and costly hangings, essences, ointments, and perfumes, as precious as gold, articles of food and drink from the foreign lands. In short, what India and Persia, Arabia, Media, Egypt, Italy, Greece, and even the far-off lands of the Gentiles yielded, might have been in its bazaars. There is a tradition in Glastonbury, England, that Joseph of Arimathea, who was supposed to be Yeshua's father, actually was a tin merchant who traveled all the way up into England to buy tin at the tin production mines there in northern England, in England. I'm not sure where in England it is, but it's in England. And supposedly there is a cathedral built there to honor Yeshua actually going there and stepping on the land there, and that is supposedly the place where the Knights Templar ended up when they returned from the Holy Land ended up in Scotland, that they worked from the Glastonbury area because that was supposed to be a place where Yeshua had literally been as a child with his father-in-law, who they say was a tin merchant. Ancient Jewish writings enable us to identify no fewer than 118 different articles of import from foreign lands, covering more than even modern luxury has devised. Articles of luxury, especially from abroad, fetched indeed enormous prices, and a lady might spend 36 pounds on a cloak. Now remember, this is in 1880s English money, okay? 36 pounds sterling. That means 36 pounds of silver, okay? Silk would be paid by its weight in gold. Purple wool at 3 pounds and 50 shillings. The pound, or if double dyed, at almost 10 times that amount, while the price of the best balsam and nard was most exorbitant. On the other hand, the most common living was very low. In the bazaars you might get a complete suit for your slave for 18 or 19 shillings, and tolerable outfit for yourself for about 3 pounds of silver to 6 pounds. For the same sum you might purchase an ass. So, wow. So you could literally buy livestock for the price it would cost you to buy clothes. An ox, or a cow, and for a little more, a horse. A calf might be held for less than 15 shillings, a goat for 5 or 6. Sheep were dearer and fetched from 4 to 15 to 16 shillings, while a lamb might sometimes be had as low as 2 pence. No wonder living and labor were so cheap. Corn of all kinds, fruit, wine, and oil cost very little. And remember, when he says corn, he's not talking about corn. He means wheat, because they didn't have corn. That's from South America. Meat was about a penny a pound. A man might get himself a small or coarse, unfurnished lodging for about 6 pence a week. A day laborer was paid about 3.5 dinar a day. Through skilled labor, if you had skilled labor, you would fetch a good deal more. Indeed, the great Hillel was popularly supposed to have supported his family on less than 2 pence a day, according to Tractate Yoma 35b, while property to the amount of about 6 pounds, or trade with 2 to 3 pounds of good, was supposed to exclude a person from charity, or a claim on what was left in the corners of the fields, or for the gleaners. To these many like details might be added. Sufficient has been said to show 2 ends of society, the exceeding dearness of luxuries, and the corresponding cheapness of necessities. Such extremes would meet especially in Jerusalem, its population computed from at 200 to 250,000, and it was enormously swelled by travelers and by pilgrims during the great festivals. The great palace was the residence of the king and the court, with all their following and luxury. In Antonia lay afterwards the Roman garrison. The temple called thousands of priests, many of them with their families, to Jerusalem, while the learned academies were filled with hundreds, though it may have been mostly poor scholars and students. In Jerusalem must have been many of the large warehouses for the near commercial labor of Joppa and thence, as from the industrial centers of busy Galilee, would the peddler go forth to carry his wares over the land. More especially would the markets of Jerusalem, held, however, in bazaars and streets rather than in its squares, be thronged with noisy sellers and bargaining buyers. Thither would Galilee send not only its manufactures, but its provisions, fish, fresh and salted, fruit, according to Mazir 2:3, known for its lusciousness, oils, grape syrup, and wine. There were special inspectors for these markets, the Agrodemus and the Agronemus, who tested weights and measures and officially stamped them, according to Baba B, Tractate 89, tried the soundness of food and drink, he quotes the Talmud chapters, and occasionally fixed or lowered the market prices, enforcing their decisions, if need were even done with a stick. Not only was there an upper and lower market in Jerusalem, but we read of its last 7 special markets, those for cattle, for wool, for ironware, for clothes, and for wood, and for bread, and fruits and vegetables. The original market days were Monday and Tuesday, afterwards Friday. The large fairs, called the Eurydion, were naturally confined to the centers of import and export, the borders of Egypt and Gaza, the ancient Phoenician mariner towns of Tyre and Akko, and the Imperium across Jordan at Botnath. Besides, every caravanserai or khan was a sort of market where goods were unloaded, and especially cattle set out for sale and purchases made. But in Jerusalem one may suppose the sellers to have been every day in the market, and the magazines in which green grocery of all kinds of meat were sold, he quotes the Talmud, must have always been open. Besides, there were many shops, the chanuyath, either fronting of the streets or in the courtyards, or else movable wooden booths in the streets. Strangely enough, occasionally Jewish women were employed in selling. This is according to Kabuth 9:4. Business was also done in the restaurants and the wine shops, of which there were many, where you might be served with some dish of fresh or salted fish, friend locusts, a mash of vegetables, a dish of soup, pastry, sweetmeats, or a piece of fruitcake, to be washed down with a Judean or Galilean wine, Idumean vinegar, or foreigner's beer. If from these busy scenes we turn to a more aristocratic quarter of the upper city, we still see the same narrow streets, but tenanted by another class. First, we pass the high priest's palace on the slope of the hill, with the lower story under the principal apartments and the porch in front. Here, in the night of betrayal, Peter was, quote, beneath in the palace, Mark 14:66. Next we come to Xystos, and then pause for a moment at the palace of the Maccabees. It lies higher up the hill, and westward from Xystos. From its halls we can look into the city, and even into the temple. We know not which of the Maccabees had built this palace, but it was occupied not by the actually reigning prince, who always resided in the fortress, this was Barras, and afterwards Antonia, but by some other member of the family. From them it passed in possession of Herod. There Herod Antipas was when, on that terrible Passover, Pontius Pilate sent forth Yeshua from the old palace of Herod to be examined by the ruler of Galilee. If these buildings pointed to the difference between the past and the present, two structures of Herod's were perhaps more eloquent than any words in the customs of the Idumean. One of these, at least, would come in sight in passing along the slopes of the upper city. The Maccabean rule had been preceded by that of the corrupt high priests, who had prostituted their office to the vilest purposes. One of them, who had changed his Jewish name from Joshua to Jason, had gone so far in his attempt to Grecianize the people as to build a hippodrome, that's a horse racing stadium, and a gymnasium for heathen games. Of course, a gymnasium is where men would go and hang out naked and get bathed. We infer it stood where the western hill sloped from the Tyropoeon to the southwest of the temple. Also, I'd like to point out that it was Jason Oniad, he's talking about Jason Oniad, who during the Maccabean revolt left and went to build the temple of Leontopolis in Egypt, in the city of Heliopolis, which is today called Cairo. That was the city that Joseph lived in while he was in Egypt. And there they built a temple. It was found in the early 1900s. It was called the Mound of the Jews by the Arabs in Egypt. And archaeologists went digging and found the remains of the temple. It was there operational until about 72 AD, till I think a couple years after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Basically, the Romans decided it was too big a risk to let them have even the secondary temple that was at Leontopolis, which you barely ever hear them talk about. The Jews in Jerusalem refer to the temple of Leontopolis as the temple of desolation, or the temple of destruction. There was a phrase in Hebrew they used to describe the temple of Jerusalem, and they would change one letter as like a pun for the temple of Leontopolis, to call it the temple of destruction or desolation instead of the temple of glory, or whatever that phrase was. Okay, it was probably this which Herod afterwards enlarged and beautified and turned into a theater. No expense was spared on the great games held there. The theater itself was magnificently adorned with gold, silver, and precious stones, and the trophies of arms and the records of the victories of Augustus. But to the Jews, this essentially heathen place over against their temple was a cause of great and deep indignation and plots, according to the Antiquities. Besides this theater, Herod also built an immense amphitheater, which we must locate somewhere in the northwest and outside the second city wall. This is, of course, according to Josephus' Antiquities and the Wars of the Jews. All this was Jerusalem above ground, but there was an underground Jerusalem also, which burrowed everywhere under the city, under the upper city, under the temple, beyond the city walls. Its extent may be gathered from the circumstance that, after the capture of the city, besides the living who had sought shelter there, no fewer than 2,000 dead bodies were found in the subterranean streets under Jerusalem. Close by the tracks of heathenism in Jerusalem, and in its sharp contrast, was what gave to Jerusalem its intensely Jewish character. It was not only the temple, nor the festive pilgrims to its feasts and services, but there were hundreds of synagogues. Some were of different nationalities, such as that of the Alexandrians or the Cyrenians. Some for, or perhaps founded by, certain trade guilds. If possible, the Jewish schools were even more numerous than that of the synagogues. There were the many rabbinic academies, and besides, you might also see in Jerusalem the mysterious sect called the Essenes, of which the members were easily recognized by their white dress. Essenes, Pharisees, stranger Jews of all hues, and many dresses and languages. One could have imagined himself almost in another world, a sort of enchanted land in this Jewish metropolis, a metropolis of Judaism. When the silver trumpets of the priests woke the city to prayer, or the strain of Levite music swept over it, because remember the Levites would actually sing great choruses together, particularly during the feast. A man would come into the city to the sound of the Levites singing, beautiful songs. Like they would lift up people as they would come in, and they would lift them up with song, the idea of entering through the gates of praise. The Levites were the gates of praise, singing as you entered into the city. And they would do that to lift you up so that you could come into the presence of God and be lifted up where He was. And the Levite music swept over it, and the smoke of the sacrifices hung like another Shekinah over the temple against the green background of the Olivet. Or when in every street, court, and housetop rose the booths at the Feast of Tabernacles, that's to say the sukkahs. And at night the sheen of the temple illumination threw long fantastic shadows over the city. Or when at Passover tens of thousands crowded up the mount with their paschal lambs, and hundreds of thousands sat down at paschal supper. It would be almost difficult to believe that heathenism was so near, that the Roman was virtually, and soon to be in reality, master of the land, or that Herod occupied the Jewish throne. He's saying that basically it was so very Jewish a place that it's hard to imagine that Herod, who wasn't really a Jew, but claimed to be a Jew, but he was an Idumean, though he married into the Hasmonean family. And here was the Roman centurion there in Fortress Antonia. You got to remember, there weren't many Romans. Judea is a small place in terms of the Roman world. It just constantly had rebellion problems. And that's why even when they were ran out by Bar Kokhba, it took them about 2 or 3 years to muster up a nice-sized Roman force to come and literally decimate the Jewish population there. I mean, when they came in, they're like, it's done. There ain't going to be another revolt, because we're going to line them up in this. I mean, they lined the streets with crosses. I mean, for like miles and miles. Thousands and thousands of people were crucified. I mean, it was the kind of thing where, like, we're going to leave a scar. What? Somebody said it one time. I'm going to leave a scar in the racial memory of the Jews so that they will never rebel against Rome again. It's something along those lines. Like in the racial memory, like somewhere in the DNA of the Jews, there is a memory of what Rome did to them, that they would never forget what happens when you rebel against Rome. Yet there he was, in the pride of his power and the reckless cruelty of his ever-watchful tyranny. Everywhere was his mark. Temples to the gods and to Caesar, magnificent and magnificently adorned outside Palestine and in its non-Jewish cities, towns rebuilt or built, Sabesti for the ancient Samaria, the splendid city and harbor of Caesarea in the west, Antipatris after his father in the north, Cyprus, Phalesis after his mother and brother, Agrippion, unconquerable fortresses such as Esebonitis and Macurius in Perea, Alexandrion, Herodion, Hyrcania, and Masada in Judea, proclaimed his name and his sway, but in Jerusalem it seemed as if he had gathered up all his strength. The theater and the amphitheater spoke of his Grecianism. Antonio was the representative fortress. For his religion he had built the glorious temple, and for his residence the noblest of palaces. And in the northeast angle of the upper city, close by, were Milo, which had been in the days of David. It seems almost incredible that a Herod should have reared the temple, and yet we can understand his motives. Jewish tradition had that a rabbi, Baba ben Buta, is he quoting it here, had advised him in the manner to reconciliate the people, in Baba ben Buddha 3b, or else thereby to expiate the slaughter of so many rabbis. The probability a desire to gain popularity and superstition may alike have contributed, as also the wish to gratify his love for splendor and building. At the same time he may have wished to show himself a better Jew than the rabble of the Pharisees and the rabbis, who perpetually would cast it in his teeth that he was an Idumean. Because like every time that they'd make sure he remembered, oh, by the way, you're not one of us. Doesn't matter who you married. You're not one. You're an Idumean, right? So Idumean would make him a descendant of Esau, right? Let's see, 1,000 vehicles carried. Whatever his origin, he was a true king of the Jews, as great, nay, greater than Solomon himself. Certainly neither labor nor money had been spared on the temple. 1,000 vehicles carried up the stone. 10,000 workmen, under the guidance of 1,000 priests, wrought all the costly materials gathered into the house. Let me help you understand. The veil in the temple was so big that it took 300 men working together to actually get the thing baptized in the mikveh properly before they could put it up, okay? Of which Jewish tradition could say, he that has not seen the temple of Herod has never known what beauty is. And yet Israel despised and abhorred the builder, nor could his apparent work for the God of Israel have been decided the most credulous. In youth he had browbeaten the venerable Sanhedrin, and threatened the city with slaughter and destruction, and again he had murdered her venerable sages. He had shed like water the blood of her Asmonean princes, and of every one who dared to be free, had stifled every national aspiration in the groans of the torture, and quenched it in the groans of his victims. Not once, not twice, but 6 times did he change the high priesthood, to bestow it at last on one who bears no good name in Jewish theology, a foreigner in Judea, an Alexandrian, and yet the power of that Idumean was but of yesterday and of mushroom growth. So basically he's saying that the King Herod was not liked by the Jews. They're obviously, no matter how much money he spent building the temple and making it this incredible, beautiful sight. Remember, again, he affixed a golden eagle to the front of it to honor Augustus Caesar and the Romans, which obviously did not go over well, or did not fly, to use my pun again, with the local people. He built a Roman or / Greek amphitheater, a place for horse races and gladiatorial events and stuff like that, right by the temple. And basically, there was, let's say, 4 main groups of thought at the time. The Sadducees were pretty Greek-minded. They were pretty consolatory to the Greeks and the royal ruling class, which is why the Sadducees ran the temple. They did not believe in the halakha of the Pharisees. They did not believe in in the non-written word. They believe what the Torah said, but they did not believe all of the oral Torah that the Pharisees taught in the synagogues. Yeah, and that is probably why they were more like it. For instance, Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. It was the Pharisees that taught there was a resurrection, because there's no resurrection mentioned in the law of Moses. Like, you have to infer from the Torah via these synthetic means of reasoning that the Pharisees were well trained in, that there will be a resurrection. Okay? So the Sadducees didn't see it, so they didn't just buy into whatever the prophet said. They said, no, there's no resurrection mentioned by Moses, so why would we believe in such a thing? So they were very pro-government, pro-Greek, pro-Roman. The Pharisees kind of backed off from political life and just taught the religion of Jewishness to the people, which taught them, the halakha, how to walk and act Jewish, how to be Jewish, how you're supposed to handle your Jewish life, what prayers you're supposed to say, what sacrifice you're supposed to make, etc., etc. Basically referring to themselves as they were the royal priesthood, right? They were when you read the book of Hebrews and you see, the priesthood in the order of Melchizedek, well, the Pharisees already considered themselves to be the real royal priesthood, to be what was meant, excuse me, to be what was meant to be for Israel. And unfortunately, because of the golden calf, Israel had lost its original hope of the covenant, which was that the firstborn males would become the priests and that they would serve the high priest. So the Pharisees were kind of teaching, God's temple, really the real temple is you. You're the real temple of the living God. Same thing you hear Peter say, right? Because, of course, this is a guy that was raised in the synagogues, listening to Pharisees talk all the time. His rabbi, Yeshua, called Jesus, by the people that don't know what Yeshua's name means, Yehovah saves. That's what his name means. It's Yehovah Hoshea, which is Yehovah who saves. Jesus was a rabbi, which is a teacher, which is exactly why in the King James it says, Rabbi, Rabbi, come and teach us. He was a teacher of the Pharisees, probably in the school of Hillel, who had a group of Talmudim, which is the taught ones or disciples, who lived with him, stayed with him. The tradition is that the Talmudim would sleep under the bed of the master, and that hopefully, I guess, that they thought maybe they could pick up on some of his vibes coming as he was sleeping, that even his dreams, they needed to be close to him so they could experience, whatever holy gifting he was given. Point being that at the time, the Essenes just stayed away. They considered themselves the super pure Jews. That, like I said, they walked around in white clothes. They were probably white linen, because they basically considered themselves to be a royal priesthood all the time. So they would just go out into the wilderness, the Dead Sea, stay away from the whole thing. Didn't like what had happened to the temple. Didn't like dealing with the Pharisees. Definitely didn't want to deal with people that weren't, in any way Jewish. And then you have the people are called the Zealots, which are basically just very nationalistic Jews. And you could have been in any of the religious schools and still been considered a zealot. But the Zealots basically wanted to get rid of everybody that wasn't Jewish that was in the land. If you were, even if you're Hellenistically minded, they wanted to get rid of you. They were going off that Judah Maccabee vibe, which is, we're going to kill off, even Jews who don't want to be Jewish. If you're a Jew that wants to be somebody, you want to be a Roman, go live in Rome. If you're a Jew that wants to be a Greek, go live in Greece. Get out of the inheritance. You don't belong here. So that's the nationalistic aspect that was going on at that time. All these different sects, all these different conflicts were happening. We still have not actually seen Yeshua show up in the book yet. And I don't know, he may never. It's my first time reading it too. It's a 1,000-page book. We're on page 84. So there's a lot of it left. But we've learned a tremendous amount about the geography of Jerusalem, the fortifications, its current king, which was Herod at the time. Just how it was like the jewel of the Middle East. Jerusalem was so full of money because of all the offerings that were being sent by Jews from all over the world. That half shekel tax, the 2 drachma tax, or the half shekel tax, adds up to tens of thousands of tons of silver, every year coming in and being used to pay for all kind of stuff in the region. So anyways, thank you for reading along with me. We'll read chapter 2 next time. That's the personal history of Herod, and the two worlds that existed within Jerusalem. And shalom. Thank you again for listening, and may you be blessed in all that you seek to do.